So I would like to introduce Tamer Atala, and he is the Executive Director of the Behavioral Health Clinical Program and a licensed clinical social worker. Tamer worked with Children's Health for 9 years before accepting his current position. Prior to working in Intermountain Healthcare, he worked at Valley Mental Health. Tamer loves a good cup of coffee and winter mornings. You might find him at Snowbirds. So welcome, Tamer, and I guess this is your time of year. You must like the snow and the cold and having a nice cup of coffee to go with it, I guess.
Yeah, there's never a bad time to have a good cup of coffee for me. So thank you, Michelle. Really appreciate the introduction. And just from a housekeeping perspective, feel free. We've got it set up in a mode right now where we want to make sure that if you have comments along the way, we can certainly stop. But I'm really excited to have an opportunity to share sort of my thoughts about mindfulness and opportunities to leverage some of that, some of the benefits related to mindfulness. But before I do, I just want to make a few comments about mindfulness as it relates to behavioral health. Historically, mindfulness has had quite an interesting journey that I'll talk about in a moment. But really, there tends to be a lack of clarity about what exactly is mindfulness and what specifically are the benefits. So we're hoping to explore that today and really talk about what the evidence says is beneficial, and some of the evidence that perhaps may not be strong, but is certainly emerging. So I'm hoping to talk with you about that. In addition to that, hoping to share a few thoughts about different ideas and practices that one could use. And then lastly, really wanted to finish off with an actual mindfulness exercise, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But first, when we think about mindfulness and mindfulness meditation can be utilized across the continuum, and by the continuum I mean can be used in everyday life. Is actually incorporated. We've incorporated mindfulness work in our inpatient settings, and so the benefits can really augment a lot of the clinical treatments that are happening within behavioral health. And so myself personally, I'm not a mindfulness expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I've really enjoyed using mindfulness personally in my own practices as we're all hurrying around and trying to be in many places at the same time, and particularly as we've been going through this new journey in this pandemic and all the changes, what we've been seeing are that disruption alone has really contributed to more individuals sort of needing help due to anxiety and depression. And a lot of that really has to do with just the lack of, the lack of stability that folks have contributes a great deal to that. But what we also find is that it's something that can be potentially mitigated in many ways. And so as we talk about mindfulness today, I want to just start by what exactly is mindfulness. So when I think of mindfulness, the actual definition is really this notion of how do you have and achieve a state of being alert and focused relaxation by deliberately, and really this sounds really simple, paying attention to thoughts and sensation without judgment. This idea of being present and paying attention to the here and now is something that as life gets more and more chaotic, the use of tools such as our phones, we're constantly being bombarded by many stimuli that really puts us in a place where we're either, when I say looking in the back seat, or always trying to anticipate what to do in the future, and oftentimes that can create a great deal of anxiety, a great deal of sort of operating in an autopilot. And so as you think about sort of, our minds, the idea of it moving in multiple directions can be really, really challenging. But if you think about mindfulness in its really basic terms, you sort of think about this, and I love this visual. When you sort of think about the past, present, and future, um, how do we effectively stay in the present and be able to take in our thoughts, and pay attention to those, pay attention to our surroundings in a really unique way, without that constant judgment that we oftentimes have. And so how do we do that? And so this isn't something that is really intuitive. It's something that requires a great deal of practice. So let me pivot real quickly and talk a bit about the history. And really, I try to break down the history really in three different time periods. And the reason I wanted to share this is first of all, I think that the history of this is really, really fascinating because it helps kind of understand perhaps some of the stigma associated with mindfulness. This notion, that it oftentimes has some perspectives for many that that really, really makes sense when you think about the history. And so certainly over 2,500 years ago, the origins were really found in Buddhism, and it was really part of their spiritual tradition. And really, the idea of practicing mindfulness, really, there was really a great deal of resistance as the idea of mindfulness was introduced into the Western culture. And interestingly enough, it was introduced in the Western culture really through psychology and medicine. So it was really seen as a curative tool, to help folks that were struggling with different mental illness or illness in general. And so what was found from that is it became a real clinical tool. And so the idea, first of all, that it was sort of a spiritual tool, a tool that is really, has those inferences sort of built into that. And then secondly, this tool that's really for when you are not well. And so that background really drove a great deal of how the Western culture first thought about mindfulness. Now, we've traced that back in the 50s and 60s. There were some really interesting writings. The Zen in the Art of Archery was one, which came out in the early 50s. The World of Zen as an East-West anthology. And then lastly, in 1960, there was the writing of The Method of Zen. So it really kind of trying to understand sort of the background of this and why it's helpful. Now, this began to pivot beginning in the 60s, where this became a technique used by psychotherapists. They used meditation, and it was especially used in psychoanalysts, and really kind of helping people kind of reflect on their historical past. And so it really had that ethos within it. And then one of the things that also emerged, specifically in the field of experimental psychology, they were examining what are the actual impacts of this notion of having a heightened awareness in the present, and broadening kind of the boundaries of consciousness. And so one of the studies really found that when you actually looked at an EEG, you could actually show persistent alpha activity with significant restful reductions, and even a reduction in the metabolic rate. So there was sort of this interesting thought, like, this using this practice really has a biological effect. Interestingly enough, there was this general lower state of arousal that came up. The wave they were talking about was the theta wave, that was really associated with sleep, and the experimental psychologists at the time were really curious about that impact. And so it wasn't really until the early 70s when there was a surge in the interest of and research in a variation of that of a form of mindfulness, which was transcendental meditation. And really, this was a very highly intensive meditation. The practice was, and the studies of those practices demonstrated reductions in psychological arousal, oxygen consumption, respiratory rates, and which was really fascinating. But the reality of that sort of meditation is it was incredibly intensive, and it required folks to utilize meditation for extended periods of time. And so it was challenging for some to engage in that kind of work. And then if you fast forward to the 1980s, I think this is really the beginnings of mindfulness that we have today. And really, this really, in my mind, originates with John Kabat-Zinn. I mean, he's really took mindful meditation really to a new level. And what he was able to do, of course, was really develop the gold standard for mindful meditation. Of course, the mindful-based stress reduction, MBSR, as it's often referred to, was really a program, an 8-week program that had some pretty incredible evidence of its impact, and specifically to helping assist and support people with stress, helping manage depression, and also managing pain over time. And so as you think about the history, you start to begin to put together the pieces of its origins and perhaps some of the potential stigma associated with mindfulness. And of course, now it's the pendulum have sort of swung the other way, where we see mindfulness everywhere. There are apps for mindfulness. There are if you were to Google, mindfulness, you would see all sorts of websites that have all sorts of content. And so from my perspective, it's one thing about knowing the history, but I was really curious of making sure that we have a really good understanding of what does the evidence actually say about the use, about the impact of mindfulness. And really, when I start to think about some of the key impacts, and we're talking about really having much more, the studies that were a lot more comprehensive, and thinking about some of those areas, the first significant benefit that was found in utilizing mindfulness is that, and this is not surprising, that really practicing mindful meditation actually increases and has an effect on our attention. And certainly the skill of practicing that is really embedded in this work. Interestingly enough, the researchers found that meditations actually help to counter this construct called habituation. And we all do this. Habituation, the best way I can describe habituation is imagine times that you've driven home from work, back when we used to do a lot more of that. And as you go into the house, you realize that you have no idea how you got home. You were essentially operating on complete autopilot. You had very little or limited awareness of what was happening, and yet you were able to make it home safely. And you sort of wonder, how did I do that? And really, that's a function that we as humans do on a regular basis in order for us to do multiple things. And so what they found mindfulness was able to do, and practicing mindfulness, it actually reduces mind wandering. And so you can imagine what that does in terms of your productivity, your ability to solve problems was found to actually improve as a result of your ability to be much more attentive. And actually, there are even some studies that have shown that improving attention, that improving attention seems to last. If you've been doing some mindfulness training over a period of I believe it was 12 weeks, the impact seems to last up to 5 years after doing mindfulness training. So it really, and what that tells me, or what it implies to me, is you tend to develop some of the traits that are associated with mindfulness, and the ability to sort of be present and attend to what's around you, and to also be aware of your thoughts and your surroundings without them completely enveloping your ability to sort of attend. The second benefit that I wanted to highlight, and there are many others, but I think these were the areas that I really found to be interesting and really strong evidence, is our ability to actually be resilient to stress. Now, what's interesting is the studies actually don't necessarily, it doesn't say that you're going to have reduced psychological or physiological reactions to threats. You're still going to have those natural responses, but the studies actually suggest that meditation actually helps the mind and body bounce back from stress and stressful situations much more quickly. And in many cases, the practicing of meditation lessens that sort of inflamed response to individuals that are exposed to some sort of psychological stressor of some sort. Particularly for long-term meditators, folks that have done this for quite some time. And so if you think about that capability and how that could benefit us, particularly in times where we have a great deal of uncertainty, that could have an incredible benefit in many, many different ways. The third area that I thought was really, really interesting, particularly about thinking about how do you measure this sort of idea or construct, is this idea that that mindfulness actually appears to increase compassion. And so what we found, what some of the studies had found, was that being able to be more present, you're able to actually see others when they're suffering, and it sort of, and so typically speaking, it sort of creates a state of paralysis for us, or even some withdrawal. But the reality is, what they found is that, and these were pretty well designed studies, that it actually increased your willingness to take action to relieve someone else's suffering. One's initiative was actually, you're much more likely to respond with compassion to others, due to and contributing to those that practicing different meditation strategies. And what ends up happening over time, particularly for people that have meditated for a long period of time, was actually activities that created sort of a default. So we started to kind of begin to operate that way, and be able to operate much more in the present. So you think about, well, how do I do that, on a daily basis? How do I, what are some daily mindful practices that I can do that could be beneficial? So the first, and I like to break these down in 3 different areas. And partly it's to sort of think about using different senses to sort of focus your attention. So the first is the body scan. And really what we're trying to do here is we're trying to have you can either lie down or you can be seated with your legs extended and really focus your attention slowly and deliberately on each part of your body in order. So think of it sort of from either from toe to head or from head to toe. And really being aware of any sensation, emotions, thoughts associated with your body. And what that does is it really allows you to sort of really be thoughtful and really be attentive to your body, something that oftentimes we struggle with, and also the emotions that may be attached as you're focusing on different parts of your body. I like to use these for individuals that really struggle with some of the breathing meditations, which can be in mindfulness activities, which can be challenging. The second example that I wanted to highlight was really this idea of sitting meditation, sitting comfortably with your back, with your back straight, your feet flat on the floor, and your hands on the lap, and breathing through your nose. And this actually allows you to focus your breath and focus on your breath. And the idea of focusing on your breath is really, really key. One of the things that I found to be really interesting about that is that you'll still have these sort of thoughts entering your mind, and your idea is not to push those thoughts away, but just to note those experiences and then return back to the breath. The last one is this idea of, and one could even do this with exercise, is this notion of walk meditation. Finding a quiet place. It could even be something as short as 10, 20 feet long, and just begin walking slowly, focusing on experience of walking, being aware of sensations of standing, subtle movement that keeps your balance. And then when you're at the end of your path, continue to walk, maintaining that level of awareness. It's amazing how we're on autopilot, even when we're walking from one place to another. And this activity actually helps us do that. And they're really easy to put into place, in really short periods of time. One of the things I wanted to also share with this group is, let me skip over here to this notion of how do we do this, and this idea of pausing throughout the day. One of the things I found to be really, really helpful is to, how do we incorporate some of those activities during the day? And I think that can be incredibly tough. And so there are a few suggestions that I would have when you think about practicing meditation. The first is, think about scheduling a time, or think about an activity that you do every day, whether that's getting in your car or whether that's stepping into the shower. Those activities that you can actually parallel with a particular breathing technique. Those can be incredibly helpful. Another thing that is really easy to do in a short period of time is another variation of the body scan, which is more of a progressive muscle relaxation. And this exercise is really simple. You just work on tensing and relaxing your muscles, one muscle group at a time, from one end to the other. And what happens is you become really, really aware of where you're tensed up in certain parts of your body, and that creates sort of an increased awareness in your body. So I think one of the important points that I want to highlight is there are many of these tasks that you can find. I like mindful.org. They've got a lot of really simple activities for you to do. And it really kind of helps us orient to what can be most supportive in your situation. Lastly, what I'd like to do, and to kind of close and love to hear thoughts or comments, is actually an exercise. And what we've done is we've went ahead and put that in the chat. Unfortunately, when I tried to run the YouTube, I was not successful. So I'm not going to do that right now, but it should be in your chat. If you wouldn't mind linking on that, it's only about 2 minutes. It's pretty short. If you could do that, I will pause for about 3 minutes, and we'll come back and join after that period of time. So I'll stop right now and give you guys about 3 minutes to do that.
Thanks, Tamara. And if you all scroll up to the top of the chat, you should see the link there, and you should be able to hopefully open it in another window and go through it.
So I don't know if the group has finished it. I think the main part of the, if you started it right away, the main part of the mindfulness exercise is likely over. So I hope you enjoyed that. I know we're at time, so I apologize for that. I just, like you said, Michelle, it would move quickly, and I likely didn't appreciate that. So let me just finish by saying that really practicing mindfulness and the opportunity to do them and incorporate them in your lives can really have an impact. It's had an impact on my own personal life, and it doesn't have to be as sophisticated as we sometimes feel it has to be. So, thank you for your time. I appreciate it, and enjoy your evening.
And yes, thank you so much, Tamara, for leading us through this and sharing all that wonderful knowledge. You got lots of thank yous in the chat and some stories about how people use different mindfulness practices, but there were no questions. So I think you did a wonderful job. And again, thank you everyone for attending. And as I said, this recording and the PowerPoint should be posted, I would guess, in the next few days. So thank you all and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody.